Can you see the? Okay. Can you see the full screen of the PowerPoint, Rosie?
Yeah, that's working fine.
Right, fine, thanks. I'll begin then. There are different kinds of histories to be told about Second World War military-industrial sites. Military, industrial, and economic histories will look at the statistics of production, how the war materials were used, and how much they cost. Social histories will look at the impact of the location of these factories on local communities and individuals within them, how people's lives were changed, and the pride communities may have taken in their own contribution to the war effort, and how the factories provided welcome sources of comparatively well-paid, albeit often more hazardous, employment. I'm an environmental historian in the final year of my PhD thesis at the University of Bristol in England. So I'm interested in the militarization of the British landscape by these sites and the physical change this resulted in. These different military, industrial, economic, social, and environmental approaches are not mutually exclusive, and looking at them alongside one another creates a more balanced, holistic appreciation of the origins and impacts of these sites. My thesis looks at the impact on British rural and peri-urban landscapes of the network of Royal Ordnance factories and military aircraft factories built by the state in the years preceding and during the Second World War. The material in this presentation is a work in progress, and I would therefore ask for your cooperation in not reproducing any of it without my permission. My thesis is primarily an analysis of the Second World War's militarization of England's landscape, as opposed to Britain as a whole, because as this slide shows, the vast majority of sites in question were in England. Air signifies an aircraft factory, ROF, a Royal Ordnance factory. Also, because most rural spaces actually lie in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, so the use of the more limited quantities of rural land in England could at least theoretically generate a greater contestation over land use during the wartime period, something that I explore in my thesis. But I hasten to add, before you click leave meeting, I will be highlighting Scottish sites tonight for obvious reasons. Here is a map showing the main sites that I will consider during this talk. One is the First World War National Factory for Munitions at Gretna. 2 is ROF Powerfoot. 3, ROF Eddingham at Dalbeattie. 4 is ROF Irvine. 5, ROF Dalmuir. 6, ROF Bishopton. And 7, the Military Aircraft Aero Engine Factory at Hillington. In particular, I will be using the example of the location of an ROF at Bishopton near Paisley, west of Glasgow, number 6 on the map, as an illustration of the factors at play in the militarization of Scottish landscapes. Other than it being part of the decision-making process for what would become ROF Bishopton, I will not be talking about the vast site at Gretna, because that was first and foremost a First World War national factory, as munitions sites were called then, but also it features in the Devil's Porridge Museum's current Landscapes of War exhibition. Nor will I say much about the Second World War site at Powerfoot, because both that and Gretna are both well covered by the Devil's Porridge Museum's own publication, The Solway Military Coast. But in this talk, I will not just show how military industrial sites changed landscapes, but also how landscapes themselves were active agents in influencing the location and form of landscape militarization in Scotland. In imbuing landscapes with agency, I do so without imposing a sentience that landscapes don't possess, at least not within mainstream contemporary Western culture. Whilst not being sentient, at the same time, landscapes were not passive, so to speak. Their size, shape, location, contours, geology, proximity to natural elements such as water, and climatic conditions around them served to either facilitate or frustrate potential wartime use. Landscapes management by people could also facilitate their utility as a military industrial site. In some instances, pre-existing rural features were retained in order to seek to disguise a site or have additional features of rurality incorporated into them, again for purposes of camouflage in order to lessen the likelihood of enemy aerial attack. For example, ROF Bishopton extended over the local rolling topography, and the site planners utilised pre-existing belts of coniferous trees to break up the factory's outlines, as well as undertake further plantation work to make the complex hard to spot from the air. I focus in my thesis on that land which was either purchased, requisitioned or repurposed from 1936 onwards by the state in order to build military industrial sites for the Army and Air Force. Sites which would, according to the historian David Edgerton, across Britain produce nearly half of Britain's wartime armaments, enabling it by 1941 to 1942 to outproduce Germany in almost all classes of weapon. I do not include in my thesis that military industrial capacity dispersed to existing civilian manufacturing sites in order to avoid enemy bombing, nor the expansion of existing privately owned industrial sites. In limiting my focus to state facilities built for the war effort, I engaged with the dichotomy that whilst the state was responsible on the one hand for altering rural landscapes in order to facilitate its war effort, on the other, its propaganda to generate popular support and sacrifice for or acquiescence towards the war effort built on existing social and literary trends, embracing and embellishing the notion of the rural idyll, thus encouraging society to identify with the rural landscape as something that was an inherent part of national identity, even if the reality was that the majority of the public might only visit it at weekends, if at all. The broadcaster and novelist J.B. Priestley commented in 1939 that the cost of the wartime effort was very often borne by the very rural areas that supposedly defined the nation. The first visual example of this paradoxical propaganda actually comes from the First World War, showing a kilt-wearing soldier encouraging the viewer to protect the thatched cottages of southern England. And the second is from the Second World War, a fictional collage of rural idyll tropes, again from England's so-called home counties. In the mid to late 1930s, there was little effective legislative protection to stop land in rural or indeed urban areas from being built on. Throughout this period, government departments, particularly the defence departments, had little statutory obligation to consult meaningfully and in a binding way with civil bodies that had an interest in any given piece of land that the state wished to take control of for war-related purposes. Similarly, the requirement for government departments to meaningfully consult with one another was limited, both because of the exceptionalism that permeated the defence departments, particularly as war became more likely, and because of the often justifiable need for rapid decisions. Both the British Minister of Agriculture and Fisheries and the Secretary of State for Scotland lobbied hard within the coalition government during the war for the needs of agriculture in support of the war effort to be considered equally alongside the Defence Department's needs for land, but only with very limited success. However, binding requirements influencing the location of sites to manufacture Defence Department's war material needs came from elsewhere within government. In response to regional inequalities, from 1934 onwards, a corridor from South Wales through the northwest and east of England and into the southwest of Scotland was designated as economically depressed by the British state and favoured for industrial development, resulting in preferential treatment for future employment opportunities. Whoever said levelling up was new? This slide is taken from a 1935 government paper indicating the distance Luftwaffe bombers would have to travel to strike at various parts of Britain. I hope that the civil servants had a better understanding of where Edinburgh and London were actually located than appears the case on the map. Particularly in the case of ordnance factories, areas furthest away from Germany and Nazi-occupied Europe were favoured, leading to a relative concentration of new build military industrial capacity in a southwest to northwest corridor from South Wales upwards into the northwest of England and on into the southwest lowlands of Scotland. As the official war historian William Hornby observes, it was fortuitous that, with the exception of Durham and Northumberland in the northeast of England, all the depressed areas came within the list of designated safe areas from bombing. From 1936 onwards, a vast construction program of new build military industrial sites was funded by the state to produce the hardware and materials needed to fight a large-scale war. Of the 82 sites across Britain that I've been able to research in any detail, the great majority were built on greenfield sites, 58 out of 82, with the balance being made up equally of brownfield and existing military sites. This is a heat map based on my data, showing the relative concentrations of new build military industrial sites across Britain. Generally speaking, the larger Royal Ordnance factories producing explosives and shells were built in rural areas, reflecting the combustible nature of the manufacturing processes involved. Military aircraft factories were smaller and generally located in peri-urban areas. That's to say, usually on greenfield sites on the edge of existing urban areas to utilize nearby available labour and existing utility and transport infrastructure. Individual stakeholders were active in seeking to influence what inevitably became a competitive process between depressed areas, seeking to attract the attention of an increasingly militarised state command economy. For example, the Scotsman newspaper reported on the 4th of November 1939 that Glasgow Corporation, Glasgow MPs and leading industrialists in the area had been lobbying the British government for an ROF to be sited at a former shipbuilding and engineering works at Dalmuir in the face of competition from 2 districts in England and Wales. Here is a slide of the pre-war use and acreages of the Scottish military industrial sites. Just take a gulp of water at this moment. Of the 6 ROFs in operation in Scotland during the Second World War, 3, the 3 largest, were built on greenfield sites, covering 3,000 acres in total, or 12 square kilometres, I think that is. And as I will show, all 3 remained in the military sphere at the end of the war. Whilst aircraft factories outnumbered ROFs by 12 to 6 in Scotland, ROFs occupied considerably more land. So the aircraft factories funded by the state that I am aware of took up just 176 acres of Scottish landscape, most notably the aero engine factory at Hillington. More about that site later. Admittedly, the amount of land that military industrial sites used was less in its entirety than, say, military airfields, but the environmental and historical significance of military industrial sites is that they represent an almost always permanent change in use for the landscapes they occupied, whereas many military airfields shared their sites with agriculture even during the war, and the majority of wartime airfields reverted back to civil agricultural use at the end of the war. I want to turn now to my main case study of ROF Bishopton as a mechanism for exploring the subject in greater detail. The search for a site of considerable size for a new Royal Ordnance factory emanated from a defence review in 1935, which identified the need to both transfer existing capacity from the explosives producing ROF at Waltham Abbey on the outskirts of London and to build into the new site significant additional capacity. Waltham Abbey was considered too vulnerable to future enemy aerial attack, probably from Germany, and was limited in its potential for expansion. As already mentioned, for reasons of safety from attack, potential ROF sites in the designated safe corridor were favoured. On top of that, economically depressed areas were prioritised. Reflecting both locational drivers, Scotland was chosen for the site, and Scottish Command's appointed land agent, J. Wilson in Edinburgh, was given a strict remit for his site search. Firstly, that his investigation should be rigidly confined to the economically distressed counties of Lanarkshire, Renfrewshire, Dunbartonshire and West Lothian, plus certain areas within Ayrshire, Stirlingshire, Midlothian and Peebleshire, and wherever there was an unbroken plot of land of at least 1,500 acres. Secondly, sites had to measure up to a number of other criteria. They had to be reasonably secure from enemy attack and within an area possible to defend against attack from the air, in an unpopulated area, serviced by a good railway service, a nearby power and water supply infrastructure capable of delivering up to 10 million gallons per day for the manufacturing processes involved. Well-drained soil, with the subsoil not necessitating extensive site preparation work. That's to say, not boggy ground, which would require deep foundations to be laid. The proximity of rivers or the sea for the convenient disposal of industrial effluent, where, quote, occasional acid contamination would not be detrimental, end quote. That's from the land agent's report. Hills were desirable, where they could be utilised as buffers between buildings undertaking dangerous manufacturing processes. But a gradual slope was desirable for nitroglycerin manufacture. Don't ask me why. Mature woodlands were desirable as camouflage for the site from the air and as a buffer against explosions caused by processing accidents or enemy bombs. There had to be sufficient labour. And finally, a moderate altitude so that climatic conditions did not introduce any added danger to manufacture. Note that in the criteria, there was no consideration to be allowed for sites with an existing amenity or agricultural value. Indeed, some of the attributes of good agricultural land, relatively flat and well drained, were also ideal conditions for building. So a clash of land values and uses was inevitable. From just a preliminary examination of Ordnance Survey maps, it was obvious to the land agent that wide areas in his target regions were unsuitable for factory sites owing to the high altitudes and rapidly changing contours. Nevertheless, Wilson identified 22 potential sites with the necessary minimum acreage, and his team examined them over a 6-day period in late 1935. The land agent was able to make some general observations to whittle down the list. In general, he found more favourable, milder weather conditions were experienced on sites west of Glasgow, whilst sites nearer to Edinburgh exhibited persistent snow and freezing over of roads. But far from impeding the investigation, Wilson found that the adverse weather conditions, quote, provided exceptionally good opportunities from an inspection point of view of judging the relative climatic conditions of different sites, end quote. I don't know whether Scottish members of the audience recognise this as a common winter weather pattern for these two parts of Scotland. Perhaps we can explore that in the Q&A afterwards. Wilson highlighted a site lying within a triangle formed by Bishopton, Georgetown and Houston, around 12 miles from Glasgow and 6.5 from Paisley, as the only site offering potential, and it was chosen for further detailed examination. The report and other government documents refer to the land as, quote, a very pleasant stretch of country where the only industry was agriculture, end quotes. For the most part, level, well-farmed land, which was desirable for a good factory layout and transport infrastructure. There were also conifer plantations and, quote, hills and slopes situated most conveniently for nitroglycerin manufacture and storage purposes, end quote. Wilson's report noted that several farms and properties would have to be bought if the proposed site was to be acquired and several existing roads closed off. Here's an outline of the site superimposed over the landscape it occupied, showing the network of railway lines that would be constructed on the site. The soil was of good stiff marl or clay, which Wilson surmised would offer very little difficulty for the construction of foundations where great weights had to be borne. The site also met the effluent disposal criteria, as waste fluids from the manufacturing processes could, quote, be disposed into a burn on the site, which ultimately flows into the River Clyde, approximately 4 miles away, end quote. Furthermore, the climate was generally suitable one. A climate comparison with Waltham Abbey was also made. Given the combustible manufacturing processes, the consistency of external temperature was very important, and Bishopton was preferable to Waltham Abbey, as perhaps surprisingly, there were greater extremes of temperature experienced at Waltham Abbey than at Bishopton. Crucially, the site was also regarded as relatively safe from attack, with the view of military staff that the proposed site was one of the most suitable in Great Britain from the point of view of security from air attack, although collectively it was noted that Bishopton, when open, together with other sites in the Clyde area, made for an inviting group of targets. Bishopton was subsequently recommended, with the choice strongly supported by both the Scottish Office and the Scottish Commissioner for Distressed Areas, and a cabinet meeting on the 8th of April 1936 authorised the purchase of 2,000 acres at Bishopton. However, concern over whether sufficient water at an affordable cost would be available locally at the Bishopton site caused land agents to explore the possibility of redeveloping the site at Gretna, a 9,000-acre former First World War national factory that had manufactured munitions. The site had been abandoned in 1921, and much of the land had been returned to pasture, with the notable exception of housing at Well Hall and derelict military industrial buildings. The Gretna National Factory had reportedly been well provided during its existence, with a sufficient water supply from the nearby River Esk. A site visit was sufficiently positive to lead to the inspectors setting out a tentative factory layout for consideration. There was concern over the Bishopton site needing to have a 15-mile underground pipeline built from Loch Katrine to the site, resulting in a higher cost and adding a further 6 to 8 months of construction time to Bishopton, over and above the time needed to redevelop Gretna, despite the need for clearance of existing derelict buildings at the latter. 6 months after the initial cabinet decision to site the ROF at Bishopton, the Defence Policy and Requirements Subcommittee met on the 22nd of October 1936 and sought to substitute Gretna for Bishopton. This led to the matter exercising a number of government departments and being discussed at length in Cabinet in the latter weeks of 1936. This at a time, not forgetting historical perspective, when the Cabinet was dealing with an increasing number of weighty issues such as the King Edward VIII saga. Central to the discussions was that the region around Bishopton had previously been formally recognised as being an economically distressed area. In Scotland, these were known as special areas, whereas Gretna was not. The Secretary of State for Scotland weighed in with a memorandum to Cabinet, stating that the possible location of the site at Gretna, quote, raises a very serious question regarding the government's position in the special areas of Scotland, end quote. The Minister of Labour noted that 64,513 men were registered as unemployed in employment exchanges in the Glasgow, Greenock, Clydebank and Dunbarton areas around Bishopton, whereas just 444 were registered at employment exchanges around Gretna. And he added that the siting of the ROF at Bishopton would make good against the government's, quote, frequent protestations of our determination to lead the way in reviving industry in economically depressed areas, end quote. On the 13th of November 1936, the Cabinet agreed on Bishopton, albeit with some reservations about the cost of construction, the cost of the provision of the water supply, and the length of time of construction. Subsequently, Treasury approval for the purchase of the site and construction was given on the 14th of January 1937. Only then, it would appear, did the plans become public, as a few weeks later, the Scotsman newspaper reported on opposition to the Bishopton site from farmers and residents within the proposed site area. In particular, the paper reported 10 farmers whose land would be taken over for the factory were preparing a petition of protest to be sent to the Secretary of State for Scotland. The petition stated that the government's site proposal was in opposition to the declared policy of the Department of Agriculture to encourage food production throughout Britain. The farmers claimed the site would take up some of the best arable ground in the west of Scotland and suggested that other land nearby was of less agricultural value. The Scotsman didn't report subsequently on this contestation, and the ROF was built, so the farmers couldn't have got very far with their opposition. In December 1937, the paper reported that by the time the ROF would be finished, it would resemble a town with streets of workshops and segregated buildings. By 1939, the cost of the plant was calculated to be £7,260,800, a not inconsiderable sum for the time, or even now. This would buy what was considered to be the largest factory of its type in Europe, during the war years, employing up to 20,000 people across 3 shifts. Ultimately, therefore, ROF Bishopton won out over Gretna. The site of 2,000 acres of agricultural land and woodland was developed from scratch, and 3 separate ROF factories were built on it. The key factor more than any other being the perceived political fallout from choosing a site other than in a special area. Consequently, a rural landscape, Bishopton, was transformed into an industrial one so that people in the immediate area could find work within Britain's increasingly militarised economy, in preference to a former industrial / part brownfield site being reused at Gretna, where labour would have to be brought in from other parts of Scotland and Britain as a whole. This notwithstanding, it was the natural and managed features in, of and around Bishopton's landscape which determined the ROF's location there, rather than any of the other 21 sites surveyed. The issue of Bishopton versus Gretna is one of only 2 instances involving potential military-industrial sites that reached the Cabinet for a decision about their location during the whole of what I call the Long War between 1936 and 1946. The second instance was whether an aircraft factory should be located in the mainly rural and agricultural English home county of Berkshire, or in an economically depressed and less rurally idyllic area in South Wales or the northwest of England. In this case, the factory was eventually built in Liverpool, and the proposed site of White Waltham in Berkshire is to this day, as far as I can tell, still farmland. This shows the issue of Bishopton and other locations for military-industrial sites to be part of a larger trend shared by economically depressed locations across the individual nations within Britain. The preservation of rural landscapes, either for agriculture or amenity use, was a luxury that could not be afforded if, through the military-industrial transformation of sites, employment could be brought to communities there. Briefly, my other example of a military-industrial site is that of the largest of the state-funded aircraft factories in Scotland, at Hillington, just outside Glasgow's then city limits. Whilst with ROFs, the location of these factories was entirely a decision for the War Office, and then when it was created in 1939, the Ministry of Supply. In the case of aircraft factories, the company, very often the motor car company that would run the factory on behalf of the government, had a significant say in where the factory would be located. Rolls-Royce had a government contract to manufacture Merlin aircraft engines for the state, and when it failed to find the suitable resources of labour and subcontracting capacity near its existing factories in Crewe and Derby in England, it agreed to a factory site at Hillington. It was close to existing transport infrastructure, main roads, docks, a railway and airport, and there was availability of labour, although initially Rolls-Royce had qualms over the likely reaction of so-called red Clydesiders to the arrival of a company still largely known as a luxury car maker. Typically of new-build military aircraft factories, state-funded but privately managed, it was in a peri-urban area. Here is a slide showing its physical relationship to its surroundings, a mix of fields and existing industry. The site was adjacent to an existing garden industrial estate, so called due to the broad tree-lined avenues, theatre, football pitches and tennis courts, which were features of this innovative design by architect Edward Wiley. In the hinterland was the recently built large housing estate of Hillington, and land was available for further housing development, which eventually became the Penny Lee housing estate. Construction work started in late June 1939, and by February 1942, 100 aero engines per week were being produced. The site was regarded as relatively safe from enemy bombing, although this Luftwaffe reconnaissance photo clearly shows that the site was known of by them. But the worst damage that the site experienced was on one bombing raid when 3 acres of roof were blown off. By October 1943, the British coalition government started to make plans for life after war, including the disposal of all those factories no longer needed. Defence departments were responsible for identifying what military industrial sites they wished to make a case for retaining for ongoing military needs, and the Board of Trade, the equivalent of a government department for trade and industry, assumed the role of leasing the factories at war's end, or sooner if possible. War Cabinet papers show 6 criteria for the disposal of available factories. The requirements of town and country planning came fourth in order of importance, after the balanced distribution of industry, the potential for new owners to manufacture for the export trade, and the maintenance of a war potential. This is a slide showing the immediate post-war use of military industrial sites built on greenfield sites across Britain, at least those I have information about. This pattern is broadly reflected in Scotland, where the 3 ROFs built on greenfield sites were retained for military purposes, and 2 aircraft factories retained an industrial function. The rationale for the ongoing utilisation of these sites across Britain in the post-war period would remain the same as in the pre-war one. War Cabinet papers from the 29th of September 1944 recognise that, quote, since many of the factories in question are located in the economic development areas, it will fit in well with the government's employment policy, end quote. Only one site in Britain, on the shores of Lake Windermere in the Lake District, just a few miles south of the England-Scotland border, was removed at the end of the war and became an amenity resource. Here's a slide of the site. The workers' accommodation is in the foreground, the factory is further back on the edge of the lake, Lake Windermere. Even then, the removal of this factory was only due to the sustained effort of amenity organisations over many years, because the site was in the middle of what would become the Lake District National Park in 1951. The last sections of the workers' village were only removed in the late 1950s. I've written a journal article about the Calgarth site and the battle to have the factory removed. I'll give publication information at the end in case any of you would like to know more about it. Britain's Second World War, in the case of those military industrial sites transitioned into civil use post-war, to a great extent, therefore represented an acceleration rather than a departure from pre-war trends. The disproportionate permanent change to Britain's landscape in this geographical corridor was as much due to the peacetime economic depression and availability of labour in these regions either side of the war as it was military necessity in preparation for war. That said, as my 2 Scottish examples show, the war was an urgent agent of landscape transformation, creating permanent urban outposts in otherwise rural areas and otherwise expanding pre-war urban areas into rural areas, leading to many rural landscapes being militarized when they would otherwise not have been, and some sites industrialized or at least commercialized earlier than they might have been, or in different places, given that industrial location criteria in peacetime and wartime were not always identical, but did overlap. At the end of the war, 19 of the 57 ROFs across Britain were retained in order to fulfill ongoing military functions. 5 of the 19 were in Scotland: Bishopton, Dalmuir, Edingham at Dalbeattie, Irvine and Powfoot. 3 of the sites had been greenfield before the war. A much higher proportion of ROFs were therefore retained in Scotland than in England. Those ROFs which no longer had a military use were the most problematic of sites to transition into civilian use. Their industrial processes very often left a toxic legacy which there was neither the political will nor the financial capacity in the immediate post-war period to address. Further, plant designs and layouts were unique to the needs of ordnance factories. The Board of Trade Journal of December 1945 noted that ROF Cardonald had been declared surplus to requirements by the Ministry of Supply, but that it required a great deal of, quote, alteration before it could be allocated to civilian uses. By contrast, factories built for producing military aircraft were relatively easy to convert to civilian, industrial or commercial use of one kind or another. Indeed, many motor manufacturers had designed the aircraft factories they were contracted to manage and had preemption clauses in the contracts giving them first refusal to lease the factory after the war for their own manufacturing needs. Of the Scottish aircraft sites I have information for, the majority were leased off and transitioned into civilian use. into civil use. Initially, instructions were issued to close the Hillington factory completely, but the Air Ministry and the Board of Trade, together with a number of other bodies in Scotland, put great pressure on Rolls-Royce to retain at least a small capacity in Glasgow in order to avoid making the entire workforce of 15,000 redundant. Rolls-Royce eventually took over in its own right some of the factory space in April 1947 and continued to produce aero engines and then jet engines, although employing only 4,200 of the wartime workforce. The rest of the site was taken over by Scottish industrial estates, which sought to lease space to suitable firms. The site closed in 2005 after 65 years as an industrial site and has since been redeveloped as a business park. As for ROF Bishopton, in the immediate aftermath of the war, manufacturing capacity was largely closed down and the site ran on a minimum care and maintenance basis. But some rehabilitation of capacity occurred from 1948 onwards, as first the Cold War and then within it the Korean War generated an increase in military spending. ROF Bishopton remained in the military sphere until 1992, and the majority of the site is now being redeveloped for housing. Bishopton is a typical example of how the ongoing identity of previously militarized landscapes across Britain remains fluid. Over recent post-war years, there's been a tendency for decommissioned RAF sites to become housing, or at least in part, amenity resources such as country parks. ROF Powerfoot has, I believe, become a site of special scientific interest and is home to a nature reserve, a rare example of a Second World War military-industrial site returning to something like the rurality that it represented up to when, from an environmental history perspective, Britain's long Second World War began in 1936. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gary. Perfect. Yeah, thank you so much. That was really interesting. So we've got time now for a Q&A session. So if anyone's got any questions, there's a chat option there, which I can read those questions out loud, or you can put your hand up. So if anyone's got a question. I actually can't see everyone. Well, I've got a question, I'll start off. I'm really interested in that idea of like the rural ideal kind of contrasting with these like military industrial structures. Like, have you found any evidence of kind of a mourning for that rural ideal, like that, not necessarily just in Scotland, but across the UK, kind of the backlash of putting these sites in green spaces? Is there anything culture that people are mourning that loss almost of something that, as you showed, represented essentially national values and their image of themselves?
Difficult one. You mean at the time or now?
I think both. I think, you know, is the legacy of that. You talked about kind of a toxic legacy. Clearly that's still being felt in some ways, but also at the time, was there a backlash at that kind of loss of space?
Well, at the time, probably is easy for me to talk about because my head's kind of in the Second World War period. Certainly, Council for the Preservation of Rural England recognised the need to kind of surrender sites in rural areas and peri-urban areas for military use, but they were very insistent during the war that it was quite a different matter come the Reconstruction period, and that there would have to be a settlement as part of the kind of post-war Reconstruction period, whereby these sites were returned to rurality. In actual fact, the fact of bricks on the ground, you know, concrete floors, meant that that hardly happened at all. And the Calgar site, which I mentioned, is in my research the only site where the factory was dismantled and parts of it sold off. And I mean, even the even the concrete slipway remains and is now part of a holiday park. So time and again, you get instances of planning authorities reshaping industrial zones in the immediate post-war period to accommodate military industrial sites, because there's no political will to get rid of them. And also, there is a need for continued employment. I think also, to try and further address your question, the notion of the rural idyll is geographically distinct, as the impression was probably given by the images I showed. It was dominated by a home counties kind of mentality, and landscapes in kind of other areas were regarded as vernacular rather than picturesque. And whilst, for example, CPRE Lancashire branch, it was resigned to having to lose so much countryside. Lancashire was probably was the county that in England which had the largest loss of rural land, in particular due to the massive ROF at Chorley. Obviously during wartime, the demands of the defense departments were pretty irresistible. But in post-war period, it was practicality. But also as part of the post-war settlement, and this is one of CPRE's major achievements, they got the state to accept that it had a role in town and country planning. And out of that came the National Park Network, which had been talked about to no real positive outcome in the pre-war period. But from the 1950s, from 1950 onwards, you get the network of national parks, in particular the Lake District.
Right, brilliant, thank you so much. There's a question in the chat saying, why was the Ministry of Supply factory at Dalbeattie referred to locally as the Admiralty? Sorry, I don't know why I said that.
Admiralty. That the factory at Dalbeattie has only come onto my radar recently, because when you do a PhD, you have to establish parameters, and so I decided to focus on Royal Ordnance factories and also shadow factories and military aircraft factories. There were some which were building, a minority which were manufacturing munitions for the Admiralty. But I've decided to include it as a Royal Ordnance factory because it was commissioned by the Ministry of Supply initially, which was responsible for Royal Ordnance factories, and then handed over to the Admiralty. So it's a grey area, but I decided to include them because ultimately it did represent another example of landscape militarization. But yeah, it doesn't surprise me that locally it's referred to as an Admiralty site. Makes sense.
So there's a few comments in the chat on some more sites. So Adrian's mentioned that there's a surviving site at Accrington, built for Bristol Aero Engines in 1938, to service Hanley Page aircraft at Wharton, used unemployed textile workers of Lancashire, and they've still got some of the original plans. And James has mentioned the transformation of RF Bishopton site is amazing. They used to cycle around it in the 1990s and goes through the fences. And as apparently there's it's now kind of lost to housing developments. That's quite interesting. And then got a question from Charlotte. So this is, you mentioned landscape having agency in the decision process to turn them into military sites. have you considered landscape agency in the post-war period, perhaps in the context of nature / rurality reclaiming the space? Perhaps this is a situation with Powerfoot. And then she says that Tim Edensaw does some interesting work on industrial ghosts. And she just said that she started an environmental history postdoc on this very topic, looking at barnacle goose, looking at the barnacle goose against the military history of the Solway. So yeah, about kind of landscape reclaiming the space, you know, I think that's quite an interesting concept. It kind of links to what I was saying about this, like that mourning of rurality, that's like kind of a human thing, whereas that element of nature kind of taking back those sites if they're kind of left out of use.
Yeah. I don't think, yeah, I mean, I agree. It's an interesting area. Maybe it will be, I want to probably in a kind of a prologue talk about the evolution of sites, but my thesis is fairly rigidly fixed to 1936 to 1946. But yeah, I mean, it is the case that slowly, very gradually, sites seem to be returning to some kind of at least socially useful purpose in the case of housing or an amenity resource, although the toxicity that still remains on certain sites might mean that human enjoyment of nature is restricted. Maybe for the foreseeable future, given Britain's need to presumably increase its armaments production in support of Ukraine's resistance of Russia, it will mean there won't be any further closures of Royal Ordnance factories at least in the near future.
Has anyone else got any questions? Ian's asking, as time has gone on, has there ever been any effort to preserve any of the buildings of the sites for historical interest?
That's an interesting one. I think, well, you've got the big aircraft factory at Castle Bromwich in Birmingham, which was a Spitfire factory. More Spitfires were produced there than any other single location, and that went into car production fairly soon after the war, and is still used as a Jaguar car plant. Up to COVID, they did a history-focused factory tour, which I was fortunate to go on before the pandemic, and so they have made something of its military industrial past. There is also a Avro Heritage Museum factory museum near but not on the site where Lancasters were produced. I've not been able to go there, but and so there's no I can't think of any museum or any kind of heritage centre focusing on Royal Ordnance factories. There's a kind of, it's not a very attractive area. You've got other aspects of Britain's war effort which have become more emblematic in terms of the Churchill War Rooms, Biggin Hill, Duxford, but military industrial sites don't inhabit the same kind of, there isn't the same kind of cultural resonance to them. Hopefully my PhD, or the book version of the PhD, if I can get it published, will give them some greater acknowledgement. But, you know, kind of, yeah, I mean, the people who worked in the factories, you know, the dangers which they experienced in terms of the hazardous working conditions, they were heroes. They did their bit, but you know, to the war, contributed to the war effort, but but they're not, they're not viewed in the same light as Spitfire pilots and other dashing figures, which is a shame. But yeah.
Yeah, that's great. I think just to add on to that, I don't know if you know, but this is more World War One, but Historic Environment Scotland are hopefully going to list the East Riggs MOD site. So I guess that's an example of, they're still wanting to kind of preserve these sites, because there's a lot. We actually visited that site on a trip, and there's a lot still there that's really well preserved. So that's a nice story, an example that hopefully that'll preserve what's on the site. We've got another question saying, were there any major accidents at any of the factories, for example, explosions that had a lasting impact on the locations?
It's not something I've researched. It doesn't form part of my thesis, but I have kind of read I have looked at material which referred to accidents. Certainly there were, and so I think some were hushed up, but I think there were more accidents in the First World War. There was a massive accident at Silvertown in London, I seem to recall. But I don't think there were any massive ones. But considering the capacity in the Second World War for enemy bombing was much greater than in the First World War, it is perhaps quite surprising. But the sites were put where they were for a reason. That, as I covered in my talk, it was one of the major locational criteria. Also, of course, it was more problematic for enemy bombers and fighters to navigate then than now. So finding these sites was difficult, and sometimes they were one of the factors that determined location was how they fitted into the contours of the landscape. So the landscape shielded them in a way from the marauding enemy bombers.
Yeah, that's very interesting. We've got another question about Defence Munitions Longtown, asking, is that place considered an ROF or is that an official secret?
I've not heard of anything at Longtown, so maybe it is. I certainly haven't. I started my PhD in 2018, so I've been working on it a while. I've never heard of anything at Longtown, but maybe that's because it is a secret.
We've uncovered something. Is there any more questions?
Can I come in with one through the mic?
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. First one, it's a comment which I don't know whether it would be useful or not, but I have a family background in the West Midlands car industry. And one of the things after the war with the shadow factories, which were run by the car manufacturers, it caused them huge problems because they came at the end of the war, they had a huge capacity in terms of massive factories, but nothing to put in them because steel supply was so short and was centrally allocated by government that they could hardly produce any cars. So they had massive factories and overheads and the workforce, but very little opportunity for revenue, which amongst other things is why in one or two cases they diversified into aluminium production, which led to the Land Rover, because there was a lot of aluminium in the system, but there was hardly any steel for car production. So for the first 5-10 years after the war, many of the British car manufacturers were in extremely perilous financial circumstances because they couldn't get the revenue. And I think that meant that quite a few of the West Midlands car factories were demolished because they were unsustainable. And just a case study, which I know slightly because we had relatives in that area. the Saunders Row seaplane factory in Anglesey, after the Second World War, that tried so many different activities to try and remain viable. It went into shipbuilding. It then got taken over by bus manufacturers and produced bus bodies out of aluminium for a long time, and then went bust. All sorts of things like that. But a lot of that factory is still there. A lot of the main buildings are still there. I haven't, we had relatives in the area, but they died a decade or so ago, so I haven't been back for a fair time. But there was a massive factory, as I say, with most of the buildings still surviving in quite dramatic extents. So I don't know. That's just some passing comments, really.
Thanks.
Okay, cheers.
Thank you so much. Is there any other questions? Otherwise, I think we can wrap up. Anything else? Any more comments, questions? Oh, we've just got another comment about there's a large Luftwaffe bomb crater in Powfoot Golf Course, and Dalbeattie was bombed, and Gretna was as well, with some serious casualties. And then we've got a comment about a film that was made called Night Shift in 1941, 1942, which features RAF Newport, Accrington, Bristol Aero, English Electric, GEC, and that was apparently showing female workforce, and it was revisited to interview ex-workers in early 2000, 2005. So that's quite an interesting film. That sounds kind of shows that industrial past as well. So is anything else before we wrap up? Thank you so much for everyone for getting involved as well. It's really nice to hear that people know of these sites in their local area as well. That's really interesting to know about. I don't think I've missed any comments in the chat either. Right, I think we'll end there. Well, thank you so much for coming. I hope you enjoyed it. We've recorded the talk, so that's going to go on the Devil's Porridge YouTube channel, so you can watch it if you've got any questions as well. Gary, do you want to put your email address in the chat just in case anyone's got any questions? I'll just pop mine in there as well. And I'll just stop recording.